Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akilia Nai, and I am the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Based on last week's dynamic discussion between party and movement veterans in regards to the history of the party, we decided to extend this into a special series where we will focus on the different decades of our party's history. This week, we're talking about the genesis of Black Power, where we will hear from Chairman Omali Yeshitela, leader and founder of the African People's Socialist Party and Uhuru Movement, Chimurenga Silambao, veteran and current member of the APSP, Vincent Lawrence, founding member of the party, and an organizer with the Black Rights Fighters out of Fort Myers. During this discussion, we ask that you engage and ask questions directed at the participants. Comrades, brothers, and sisters, what you're about to hear today, this is our history, the reason we fight and struggle to build and win. It is my honor now to turn it over to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who will open up this discussion for us today. Uhuru.
Uhuru, comrades. I want to thank Director Akilia Nai for introducing today's study. I also am hoping that Joseph Wall, who was with me and 4 other persons when we tore the mural down, the infamous 8 by 10 foot mural that hung on the wall of the St. Petersburg City Hall. I'm hoping that he'll be able to join us by phone as well. First of all, I just want to remind everyone that we'll be starting this discussion as it comes from, stemming from Chapter 5 of Uneasy Equilibrium, which is the political report to the 6th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. We wanted to do this because it's extremely important for all of us, and particularly members of the African People's Socialist Party, people of the Uhuru movement, and all the party organizations. And we think the people at large to understand that that the present contains within it aspects of the past, and that's how you get to the present, through coming through struggles of the past, because we know that there are many people who are active today who have no understanding or very little understanding of what it was that brought us here. When I say us here, I mean in terms of what was happening in society, what are the historical forces that gave rise to where we are today. Some people discovered police killings and things like that only recently, and as they came themselves into political life, have operated from the assumption that history began with the beginning of their own participation, and that's problematic, to say the least. It's understandable, but it's extremely problematic. It's understandable because I think it was Marx who said that people get born into situations that give the impression of having always been like this, but it's not. Nobody gets a course on history upon birth. So it's really important for us to understand some things in order to understand how we got here, what were we pursuing in the process of our struggle to get for freedom that brought us here today. What I'd like to do is to begin this discussion by reading briefly from Chapter 5. And the title of that chapter, the overall chapter, is The History of the Party. But on page 160, for anyone who might have the Uneasy Equilibrium, the political report, the book, within immediate reach, on page 160, in the middle of the page, the subtitle, Jomo and the Birth of the African People's Socialist Party. The Uhuru movement preceded the organization of the party. In 1966, when I was an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee based in St. Petersburg, Florida, we launched the demonstration that resulted in the defiant removal of a hideous 8 by 4 foot racially demeaning mural that had hung in the wall of the City Hall for more than 30 years. In 1968, from a prison cell where I was serving time on felony charges stemming from taking down the mural. And during the thick of the Black Revolution of the 60s, I formed the Hunter of Militant Organizations. Jomo was the Florida-based leader of the African workers' movement that bore some semblance to the Black Panther Party that had arisen on the West Coast of the United States at that period. The Black Panther Party and Jomo emerged on the scene at an important historical intersection, when the interest of the African working class rose up inside the movement that had up until then been dominated by the interests of the African petty bourgeoisie. SNCC, the militant wing of the struggle for democratic rights, led by mostly young student-based Africans, was the crucible for this class struggle, transforming the movement from one primarily for reform to an anti-colonial movement for Black power. Many of the young students and workers of SNCC came under the ideological influence of Malcolm X, who had been assassinated by the US government in 1965. As the public face of the Nation of Islam before his break with that organization, Malcolm X made incessant forays into revolutionary politics, challenging the philosophical idealism that characterized the Nation of Islam. In 1965, SNCC organized the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Alabama. The Lowndes County Freedom Organization represented an ideological and political escalation of the struggle for electoral political power that broke with the near total loyalty of Africans to the bourgeois Democratic Party and the principles of philosophical nonviolence. The Lowndes County Freedom Organization's symbol, I want to stop there just briefly to recount that, because there's a whole array of forces now coming into political life, and many of them are being driven and pulled into political life by a lot of big money from the bourgeoisie. The Democratic Party is making a real drive to win African people to the Democratic Party, and particularly African women, young people, what have you, to rescue the fortunes of one sector of white power that's in a contest that with which it is engaged in a serious kind of contest. And a narrative is being developed now in terms of how somehow participating in the Democratic Party, either as somebody associated with Bernie Sanders or one or the other of these forces, or the Me Too movement, or the young women, Black women involvement in the Democratic Party, that somehow this is a real great departure, that it is moving forward our struggle in some dramatic way, and that's not the case at all. And I think it's important to make that point, because what we saw was that in 1964, at the National Democratic Convention that occurred in Lowndes County, Alabama, where the white liberals had made an agreement with sectors of our movement. And I say our movement, I'm talking about a time, this was before even the victory that brought about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that provided some universal suffrage. That is to say, everybody was supposed to be able to vote as a consequence of that. Up until then, as most of you know, Africans were denied the right to vote and were killed, murdered, slaughtered, bombed, lynched throughout the South for just trying to register to be able to vote. So 1965 was the time passage of the Voting Rights Act. But 1964, Africans had gone to Atlantic City, New Jersey, to participate in the Democratic National Convention after having made a deal, many of them having made a deal with the liberal sectors of the Democratic Party that includes sectors of labor, as well as some of the other liberals attached to the Democratic Party. And what was to occur at that convention was that the 1964 Freedom Summer that happened in Mississippi was to result in Africans demonstrating a real desire to vote by registering Africans, since we couldn't participate in the white nationalist lynch mob, white Democratic Mississippi Party, to create a Mississippi Freedom Party and go through all of the moves of having the convention open to anybody according to the principles of the Democratic Party and to the constitutional principles of the U.S. And so agreements were made. Somehow the liberals were going to deny seats to the lynch mob Democratic Party, and the Freedom Democratic Party from Mississippi would be able, Africans would be able to take those seats because the Africans adhered to all of the principles of the Democratic Party and the Constitution, and was open this process up to everyone. But what happened, of course, is the Democrats double-crossed us. The great shining example of white liberalism that exists up to this day, Lyndon Baines Johnson was one of those who was the architect of the forces who manipulated, pushed Africans out of that process. He used Hubert Humphreys. He used Walter Mondale. All of these people came to persuade Africans that we should not make this contest with the liberal sect, with the reactionary, I say reactionary, but that sector of the Democratic Party in Mississippi. We should not do that, and that what the Democrats would give us was two non-voting seats. At the convention. And of course, Fannie Lou Hamer made the notoriously famous statement that we didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. And so the Democratic Party did everything. They frustrated that. Lyndon Baines Johnson held a press conference at the very same time. Fannie Lou Hamer would be making her presentation to the Rules Committee to show why the Freedom Mississippi Democratic Party should be seated as opposed to the regular lynch mob white clans. Well, I don't even want to use the term clans because that understates who they were, but the Democratic Party from Mississippi. And when that happened, and the Democratic Party refused to seat the people who had come from Mississippi, SNCC led a group of people from that into Lowndes County, Alabama, where they would create the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which would be SNCC's move away from simply trying to get elected through the Democratic Party, but had begun to develop a strategy of going into majority African counties and what have you, and running our own independent political efforts to capture political power. So this is what happened, and this is where Lowndes County Freedom Organization is. We'll say a little more about the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Lowndes County, Alabama, but the basic point I want to make is that the Democratic Party then double-crossed us, and it has done that historically. The political parties are arms of the state, and then we get tricked into restricting the struggle that we're involved in to one of these, to the electoral process. That's the restriction. And when I say to the electoral process, and I'm also talking about either the Democrat or Republican Party, that's mostly what it is that we're talking about. And when Africans say that we're not going with the Democratic Party, then it's somehow a betrayal of some trust that has been given us, and horrible things are going to come, because after all, voting for the Democratic Party and participating in the electoral process is in the Bible or something to that effect. So I wanted to say that. So in 1965, SNCC organized the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Alabama. The Lowndes County Freedom Organization represented an ideological and political escalation of the struggle for electoral political power that broke with the near total loyalty of Africans to the bourgeois Democratic Party and the principles of philosophical nonviolence. And because not only did SNCC leave Atlantic City and go to Lowndes County, Alabama, SNCC also armed itself and armed others. Well, Africans already had guns. And I don't want there to be any illusions about this. I mean, it was the petty bourgeoisie African civil rights people who came in and struggled that Africans should take a nonviolent stance, but Africans had guns, had at least shotguns and things like that. And so now the position of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization was that we would shoot back. And the Lowndes County Freedom Organization's symbol was the Black Panther. That soon became iconic when it was taken up by the California-based Black Panther Party at its formation in 1966. So the Black Panther Party, and this is what the white journalists began to refer to the Lowndes County Freedom Organization as the Black Panther Party. And its symbol was the Black Panther, just as the symbol for the regular white Democratic Party was a rooster, a white rooster. And the panther symbolized strength and courage and defiance and a willingness to fight. And of course, obviously a rooster wouldn't stand a chance against a panther. So this symbol had some significance, some meaning, and that's where it came from. That's where the Black Panther Party, that's what the journalists began to refer to the Lowndes County Freedom Organization as the Black Panther Party. Almost simultaneously, the SNCC chapter in St. Petersburg, made up of African workers free of the petty bourgeois idealism of philosophical nonviolence, adopted the Black Panther as our symbol that adorned the outer wall of our office building on 22nd Street South. Now this is important, and sometimes even I muddle up this historical significance, because the SNCC organized in St. Petersburg, Florida, was the first membership-based SNCC organization in the country. Second, the SNCC organization in St. Petersburg, Florida was not an organization of students who came in to organize the workers in almost some missionary fashion. It was, from its inception, it was an organization of the African working class. It was led by the African working class, and it was an organization of the African working class. So it was not like some student-led process. It was not like some good guys came from the north and began to set up processes through which Africans would learn how to struggle. And that would simply organize the African workers. So the St. Petersburg Workers SNCC organization also adopted and popularized the slogan demand uhuru, meaning freedom in Swahili. The slogan uhuru had been initiated by the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, or Mau Mau, that fought the British for independence in Kenya in the 1950s. Malcolm X introduced the slogan in the United States, and also it was a slogan that you could hear in SNCC as well. SNCC, you would hear that slogan throughout SNCC, not just in St. Petersburg, but it became our slogan. That's to say, you might hear someone say uhuru, you might hear people who were familiar with Jomo Kenyatta and Oginga Odinga, who would say not yet uhuru. This is the book that was written by Odinga, who was an opponent of Jomo Kenyatta. So they knew that. But in terms of it becoming the slogan that you would hear, that would resonate almost everywhere, not only within SNCC, but throughout the African community. It was SNCC under that we organized here in St. Petersburg that did that. So Jomo was organized in 1968, after I began to recognize the limitations of the civil rights movement in the wake of the repression that targeted SNCC. The formation of Jomo was an attempt to respond to those limitations through what I conceived as a united formation of SNCC-like militant groups, a junta, that I naively envisioned would provide leadership for the entire movement throughout the United States. A later attempt led by SNCC leader James Foreman to merge SNCC and the Black Panther Party was a similar effort to resolve some of the same contradictions we were looking at. In fact, one of the questions that SNCC was grappling with publicly was how to unite the rural southern-based struggle of African people in the South with this clearly emerging militancy that was happening in urban centers throughout the United States. And so actually the SNCC organization that was organized by the party, by us, here in St. Petersburg, was a response to that. We were an urban-based working class organization, the first SNCC organization that was essentially working class led, and that was a membership-based organization. That's one of the things that gave us, I think, some of the characteristics that were to be found in the Black Panther Party, but that was also something that distinguished us, I think, from SNCC in general, because SNCC in and of itself was not it was the bridge between the civil rights movement and the revolution. And contained in SNCC were some of the most serious, articulate, erudite practitioners in nonviolence, believers in nonviolence. The name of the organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And some people, like Bob Moses, it wasn't just a term. This was there were real deep and profound philosophical commitment to nonviolence, and that way, SNCC was not, and he was not distinguished that very much from what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was, except they were younger. They had obviously more courage. They had they were unwilling to take a slow path. And in fact, one of the interesting kinds of contradictions that emerged in this period, and it's strange now to think it would be controversial, is that while SCLC, I think it was, that had a slogan, a demand for freedom, and SNCC's demand was freedom now. And freedom now, that seemed like a really radical stance, because it was opposed to any kind of gradualism that one day, etc. Freedom now, that was SNCC's demand. Freedom now. So shortly after our formation in 1968, Jomo launched the Burning Spear newspaper in tabloid form as our political journal, still published today by the African People's Socialist Party. And I say in tabloid form because the first Burning Spear was what they call a mimeographed spear. It was like on 11.5 by 7 paper that you could copy off, etc. That was the first, and it had the Burning Spear symbols attached to it, but that was the first Burning Spear. The pages of the spear over the years remind us that our history of struggle for our liberation was forged in contention with the various and sundry organized representatives of the imperialist white ruling class, as well as with opportunist sectors within what has generally been considered the African liberation movement. 4 years after its creation, it became clear that Jomo had also reached its limitations with the decision to form the African People's Socialist Party. We understood that the only way to end our oppression was through struggle for political power in the hands of the organized African working class. We saw the party as the highest expression of the will to struggle, to win, and to wield political power. The creation of the African People's Socialist Party was our practical answer to the question, struggle toward what end? And so Jomo organized an intense effort to build the party prior to the former merger of the three organizations that became the party of today. For months, meetings were held in different home-based cities of a number of militant organizations throughout the state of Florida, whom Jomo targeted for consolidation into a single party. So I wanted to just lead off with that introduction to this discussion. And I don't know if Jody Wall, is Joseph Wall, do we know, has he called in? Did we call him to remind him to call in? But in 1966, I was really impressed early on with SNCC. I had begun organizing here in the military. Actually, I had begun organizing in the military. I had joined the Army after having, just turned 18 years old. Ended up in Berlin, Germany, and had some interesting experiences there. facing Russian tanks and the development of the building of the wall that characterized the Berlin Wall. I was there when that happened. I was there to step outside of this narrow perception that many of us have about the world from these communities that we are generally trapped in. And I met Africans there from all over the world. I went to the homes of Africans from Somalia. I had discussions with Africans from various places in West Africa as well. And then I met others. I met, as I mentioned, I was in Berlin. I was there when the Berlin Wall was put up. I saw the U.S. military, certainly the general who was there at the time, leading the U.S. contest with the Soviet Union, because Berlin, Germany, as you know, was occupied at that time. It was occupied by Soviet, which is to say Russian, by U.S., French, and British troops, because Germany had lost the war. And it was occupied. The thing was to tame Germany and to bring it into this new order that was being organized by the victors, the capitalist victors. All of them were capitalists, the Germans, the French, the Americans, etc. So it was occupied. And I happened to be there. I happened to watch, what other people were reading about in the U.S. and around the world. I saw the provocations that the United States government was making toward the East Germans who were, quote unquote, on the side of the Soviet Union, lined up with the Russians. I saw this with my own eyes, I was struck by it. And also, here I am in a tank, freezing, and the first time in my life being in cold weather, facing Russian tanks and the possibility of dying and killing, while at the same time I'm hearing stories of African people in the United States who are just trying to vote, just trying to join the Democratic Party, being bombed, being shot at, being victimized, etc. And obviously that created some profound conflict with me in my own mind. And I came back to the United States and forced the United States. I quit. Literally, I quit the U.S. military, and they escorted me off at gunpoint because I had begun to organize there. I had begun to organize. So this would have been in 1963 when I was doing very serious organizing within the U.S. military. I upset an entire division, a U.S. military division in Georgia, literally, and brought it to a standstill. Just one African struggling around the treatment of black people and just absolutely, totally refusing to accept the definition of this relationship that had been imposed on us. And I had written a letter to John F. Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was then the President of the United States, telling him that I needed out of it. I didn't need to be. It's 13 pages. I remember that on yellow pads, telling him that I needed to be out of this military because I did not, could not see myself protecting George Wallace and all these other reactionary crackers and stuff like that. So I want out of here. And they began this process then, and then I began to move in a way that made them extremely uncomfortable at military base. And the reason I say I could shake up an entire division is because the whole civil rights movement is now rising up and is shaking everything in the United States, and everything is being questioned now. And here I am, here, and they don't even know if I'm a plant. This is really interesting because they don't know if I'm some kind of plant by one of the civil rights, and I acted like I might have been. So they were really unnerved by this. The possibility of it embarrassing the U.S. government, the U.S. military. And you got to remember, at this time, it was important because the United States was trying to prove to the world that capitalism was better than communism, and the Soviet Union was reaching its hands out and arming and supporting struggles of black people and other people all around the world, saying this is the best deal in this struggle with the United States, capitalism. And so the United States got to prove that it's the best. So it has to try to smother or obscure all of the contradictions existing here, but that's hard to do when you got white people with water hoses, with fire hoses, washing down Africans who are just trying to register to vote. They just want to be a part of the Democratic Party, which has always been a sellout organization. It's never been a revolutionary organization, but even that was not tolerated. Even that could get church bombs and African people assassinated, as we saw happening during that period. So this was part of the whole situation in which, I came back to St. Petersburg, and initially I got a job, first as a laborer. They have the fancy terms for it, but as a laborer, and then I got a job for the St. Petersburg Times as, a couple of Negro firsts there, and they had high hopes and expectations of me because I had a firm handshake and a quick smile, and I looked them in the eye when I smoked, and I was clean shaven and all of that. So they had a lot of high expectations for me, but it did not take very long for it to become clear that I left the St. Petersburg Times momentarily, and I went into Los Angeles, California. And I thought I was on a leave, an educational leave, to go to school. But when I went to California, the Watts Rebellion happened in 1965. And I happened to be in Los Angeles when that happened. And that was an eye-opening experience as well. I mean, that's where you really saw the power of African people, to be walking through Los Angeles and using these buildings and things like this as markers to be able to find your way back. Because I'm walking all over the place, I don't know, but when you come back, the things are gone because Africans have wiped them out, destroyed them completely. This is Los Angeles. This is 1965. And the Los Angeles Times at the time did not have a single African reporter. None of them did. So none of them could even know what the hell was happening there because they did not have access to. In fact, I ended up writing a couple of sellouts. For me, it was a sellout kind of pieces that the St. Petersburg Times printed because no other person, no Africans, they had no press in there. This was incredible. I mean, Africans really dominated that thing. So I came out of Watts, California, and ultimately got back here and began to organize. And it was stuff was happening everywhere. And St. Petersburg, Florida, is where we were able to begin organizing, and the options were, I actually had attempted initially to become a part of the Nation of Islam because I really was impressed by Malcolm X and actually had a meeting with the Nation of Islam in my apartment, and it became too much drama associated with it because they have created this narrative about Islam, etc., and I knew more about the history of Islam than they knew about the history of Islam. So when I would challenge some of what they were saying about it, then they would get upset and they became afraid of me. And when they became afraid of me, I became afraid of them because it got to be really tense. But the thing always disturbed me because you don't have to trick African people to be engaged in the struggle. I mean, you don't have to make up anything. Reality is enough. Expose the reality, and that's what will do it. And so that was one of the contradictions I had. I couldn't go with the Nation of Islam. And then people were looking, the organization seems to be the NAACP. I actually went to NAACP meetings. I tried to join the youth wing of the NAACP, but they were so silly. They were dramatically silly. They were just, they would participate in what was supposed to be a demonstration where they would all just walk in a little circle and And they were supposed to have been trying to integrate some theater downtown, and they walking in the circle, and they would actually prance in a circle, and they'd get to the window I'm going to buy a ticket, and the woman say, we don't sell tickets to black people or something like that. They say, okay, and they bounce off and just go around and around. That was the silliest thing I ever thought about. See, if you're serious about this, then at least you got to represent a threat. I mean, nobody's scared of these clowns, coming around like this. At least you got to represent a threat, and they couldn't represent a threat. So and then there was the SCLC or SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and SNCC really resonated, partially because it too was influenced seriously by Malcolm X by now, and also it was a young organization. It was filled with courage, and SNCC would go places and do things that none of the traditional civil rights movements would do. So that's how we ended up with SNCC, and I. Working with primarily with John Bryant, who was the project director of SNCC, and I became co-chair, and these are titles that we came up with, and co-chair because at the time Stokely Carmichael, who later became known as Kwame Ture, was the chair of SNCC, and so we are given structure to something that didn't have that kind of structure because it didn't have membership organizations and chapters and branches like that. And anyway, we ended up attacking that mural that was downtown in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Black Power was something that had begun to really shake up white people in this country to an extent now that it would be hard for people to imagine. But it was a frightening specter to have African people who no longer were going to play the game, who were no longer going to be a part of this pretense relationship that had been created for us, who was saying that we want Black power. We were saying black is beautiful. I mean, we were saying things that went against the grain. Everything that was taught in this country, about blackness was that was horrible, bad, etc. Just like it is now. This is how it was then, and it's hard for people to even imagine what we went through because we had to defeat that. And that's why even the concept of black became important because it was the boogeyman. If you were black, that was a characterization, a negative characterization that even in the African community, people had a problem trying to deal with because everything white was good. We used to use the thing about, the absence of sin was white, and angel food cake was white, and devil food cake was black, and sin was black as sin, and these were things that were connoted for to defining the relationships between the two of us. And then you had this incredible movement of Africans saying, my hair nappy and my skin is black, but I am beautiful, and this boom, and it was such an ideological, powerful thing that it shook white people up. Because white people had defined us as the antipode, as the opposite of them, and everything about us was ugly and bad and stupid, etc., and everything about them was just the opposite. So if black is beautiful, what the hell is white? You understand? That was the question. If black is beautiful, and it was traumatic, it really was traumatic for white people to experience this. And then you had Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam saying the white man is the devil. What the hell is going on? There was a powerful ideological assault on the whole ideological foundation of this relationship for Africans to even think of ourselves as good. To think of ourselves as beautiful was a profound kind of movement. And it had a real serious impact. So those white people had that mural down at the City Hall. Here's an 8 by 10 foot mural that depicted African people in this horrible way. And so after some discussions, we went in and during a demonstration and tore the mural down. And Jody Wall, and I turned and walked into the City Hall during a demonstration, and Jody Wall, who was 17, he was the youngest of us all, he came in behind me, and then, we've searched for a place to find a place where the mural was loose, and snatched it off the wall and walked out with it. And that was SNCC. And this thing, it exploded all over the U.S. I mean, I think we centerfold in Jet magazine, stuff like that. And this was considered by some as the first Black Power action that happened in this country. And that was in December, December 29th, 1966. And then barely 4 months later, the Black Panther Party went into the city, to the State Assembly building in California, and with the guns. So we preceded that, and what's really interesting is that we had an office on 22nd Street South here in St. Petersburg, the SNCC office. And as I said, it was the organization of working class people, and the huge Panther was on the front of the building. So we marched from the Panther office. This is really interesting. We marched from the Panther office to the City Hall, tore the mural down, and then 4 months later, then the Panthers marched from the Panther office and went into Sacramento and with the guns. And so it was a whole new era that clearly had been entered upon by the struggle of African people in this country. So, the problem with that, of course, is that I went to prison, and a whole bunch of other people. John went to prison, went to jail. I was the only one that actually went to prison. But they held Jody for a long time in jail too, Jody Wall, who I was hoping could be here. They held him in jail for a long time as well. So I went to prison. But it immobilized a lot of the forces who would be the leadership of the organization were now jailed, in prison, etc. So that was an issue. We were then later to move toward a period where we would be working to build JOMO. Because it was, JOMO came out of that process because SNCC was under serious assault. I mean, SNCC was being framed up in Philadelphia with plots to blow up this and blow up that, so-called bombs they said they discovered in the SNCC office. SNCC organizers being arrested in various places. A young brother out of Texas, I can't think of his name now, but he was arrested and for having a marijuana joint and given something like 10 or 15 years in prison. I mean, the whole SNCC organization came under assault. Initially, because they used the fact that we were young people and we had sort of split from the traditional civil rights movement that had this arrangement, even if it were unspoken and even if it was one that the total bourgeoisie was not a part of. It was an arrangement with a sector of the ruling class. And the deeper we got into struggle, the more the civil rights organizations and movement was appreciated by white power when compared to Malcolm X, compared to the Panthers, compared to the stuff that Jomo and the rest of us were doing, compared to SNCC. Then that moved away from the nonviolence and all this other stuff. Then, within that context, the civil rights people became really beloved by white power. And they still are beloved by white power because they don't stand for anything but kissing white ass. But the rest of us made that departure, and that was a profound difference. And the government now begin to find ways to undermine, discredit, and what have you, and attack the revolution. And it came up with various counterinsurgent methods. They killed Malcolm, they killed King. They killed members of the Black Panther Party. I was in and out of prison so often. I mean, with great regularity. Not only was I in and out of prison. Attempts were made to assassinate me. I was handcuffed in the backseat of a police car, beaten and that kind of thing, and it didn't work. And so, later on, we began working to try to build the party, and comrades out of Fort Myers, the Black Rights Fighters under the leadership of Lawrence Mann, and Gainesville, Florida, the Gainesville Black Study Group under the leadership of Keturah Carey, who was a teacher there. We came together and built the party. And it was an incredibly significant union. And it was done at the very same time that the Black Revolution of the 60s was under fire, being under assault throughout this country. And the Gainesville study group was comprised, essentially of intellectuals. I say intellectuals, but some of them were just students, working class students. But they were under the influence. It was the study group. It was people who had come together for investigating, studying, like the struggle, and they were active as well. Keturah Carey was an incredibly powerful and dynamic leader that I cannot say enough about. And then out of Fort Myers, there was the Black Rights Fighters led by Lawrence Mann. And there were other groups in Fort Myers that Vincent Lawrence, who is on this call, will probably mention as well, that we tried to bring into organization to build the African People's Socialist Party. And much of this work, I should say, occurred in the process of building for the first African Liberation Day demonstration that ever happened. And that was in Washington, D.C. That would have been May 27th, if I'm not mistaken, 1972. And we characterized that as the founding date of the African People's Socialist Party. And so I just wanted to say that. I know that was a pretty long overview, but I wanted to offer some historical context. And I want people to read this. And the reason these discussions, I think, are important is because history is living. I mean, it's a living history. And there's a way when you only have access to the books, you can read about it, but you don't get a sense of people and places and how, and the various kinds of things that played into mobilizing individuals and during this time. And there's something that you should be able to detect by those of us who are talking about this, about that period, other than a date and a place. So perhaps, Vincent Lawrence was the right-hand person for Lawrence Mann, who was the leader of the Black Rights Fighters. And I said they did work essentially with migrant workers, and they introduced us to the plight and struggle of those Africans who participate in this migrant stream. Florida had a really active migrant stream of workers that actually came from various places around the country, but also came from the Caribbeans and what have you. Many of them came through Florida. And Vincent Lawrence and Lawrence Mann were in the mix, and they brought us into this relationship. So are you there, Vincent? Are you muted, Vincent? I know you were muted early on. Uhuru, Vince? Uhuru, come man. So yeah, I was just, I don't know if you heard the overview that I just laid out.
Yeah, I heard it. I was listening the whole time.
I think that you are close to. I think you have to turn your computer. I think you have to turn your computer off, mute your computer, because it's feeding. It's feeding back into it.
Okay. I'm trying to find. I'll just turn it off and then come back on. I'll turn it off and come back.
Okay.
All right. I turn it off.
Good. So you heard the overview that I just gave, Vincent, and perhaps you can just talk about the Black rights fighters and you and Lawrence Mann, and like what was going on, what brought you into this process, even some of the stuff that we were doing early on.
Yeah, well, the Black rights, like initially started behind, it was a girl that got killed. Matter of fact, she was on the street and everything, and she was last seen getting in the car with a white guy, and so and then when she ended up dead, everybody kind of, it was easy to figure out what had happened, and that's what it kind of started. So they had a riot, a bunch of stuff, and so we just, much people who were mad got together and decided, to organize and need some type of organization. So that was when the creation of the African People's, the Black Flag came to being. And at first when we organized, they voted on who should be chairman, who should be this and that, but it didn't really bother us. Like what I'm saying, us, me and Lance, who were the chairman and all that stuff. Because what we did, we worked in the background, but it ended up we took over anyway. So, but we did try to give people the instructions, because they voted on who they wanted and everything. And then from there, but what we really did was we were working with Florida Rural Legal Services, as what's called legal investigators. What you do is go out and get find, whatever people had problems, just try to solve them and bring them in, get some lawyers to help them out with it. And then from there, we went on to organizing, because it was a good platform, because we didn't have to worry about nobody coming up and threatening jobs and all that kind of stuff. So we did everything. Matter of fact, the government tried to shut Florida Rural Legal Service down 2 or 3 times, because most of the investigators community activists, and that was some, and we was all over, what they call them, all over the southern, the lake there, like lake over, like within Belglade, Pioke, all that kind of stuff like that. But that's when we hooked up with a lot of other different people, and from that, from the organization, we decided we need some type of voice. And so, with me and Lawrence, matter of fact, that's all it was, me and him, decided to a newspaper, which, which is called the Up in the South. And matter of fact, I think that's when we first run in, because we heard about the burning spear and wanted to know how to operate a newspaper. And, we got pointers from you, and then more than pointers, we got to meet you, and that just, everything else was naturally took over. And from that, we were kept organizing more from it. And keep hearing hard, sharp sound. Are we still on?
Yeah, we on.
Oh, okay. All right. So hearing a sharp sound going on. Anyway. Yeah, and that was just the groundwork that we was doing, working with migrants. We also worked with, not only migrants, we worked with, people who had different problems, whatever the problem they was, they're bringing us, and we do our best to try to solve them legally or whatever kind of way we could.
So what year was it that the young woman was killed in Fort Myers?
What year was Lawrence killed?
No, was you said that there was a sister who was killed in Fort Myers? She got in the car.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was back in, I'm not quite sure what year. It was about a year before. I think it was a year before we met up with you.
Okay.
I can't exactly remember what year it was. It was the early '70s. I know it was. So we was working on the paper. Might have been the late '60s.
Right. And you
But I know she was. Go ahead.
You were beginning a newspaper called Ebony Star.
Yeah, Evan Star.
And as you remember, you remember hooking up with us at that time to get some pointers on how to, because we were doing the Burning Spear, get some pointers about how to do the newspaper. Is that how you remember it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember if you came to St. Peter, did we go to Fort Myers?
I think it was at a different place, but we did come to St. Peter a couple of times, and then we started coming to St. Peter all the time. Then that's when we started, regularly meeting up with.
Okay.
Because the ran for, Lawrence was the editor. And like I said, one with two of us, so we was the whole newspaper. And matter of fact, at the beginning, wasn't nobody but him, but me and him used to be together all the time. So he was working for this guy. Ended up, he was a black guy named Willie Green, who had a sign company and was kind of independent, black businessman. And from there, he said he would, finance the paper for us. And so what we did is, so Lawrence was getting it together, and then I remember the very night we were trying to put the paper together. He said, "Come on, you got to help me with this." So I said, "Okay." So then he was putting it together, and he said, "We're gonna need a photographer." I said, "Good, we'll find one." And he said, "You got to be it, because ain't nobody helping me and you." It's kind of funny, but that's what. And so we started working from there. And the paper we did pretty good, because I always liked Lawrence editorial. I got some parts of the paper somewhere in my stuff right around here, and it kind of caused a lot of uproar, because where Lawrence, what his editorial was about, was about what was real happening in the community, and how you could solve them, and we came into a lot of fight and a lot of stuff, but we hung in there with it though.
How old were you then?
Oh man, let's see, I had to be in the 20s already. Let's see, I am 30, 40.
How old?
Probably, we was in the 20s.
Yeah. Okay. You didn't stay 20 though, did you?
No, I think, you either get old or die.
Yeah. History does occur. Yeah. So, Chimaringa, I don't know when you met, Vince and Lawrence Mann and what have you. Do you remember?
I do not. I remember Lawrence Mann more. I think I might have met Vince once or twice. But
can Chimaringa be heard? Is he being heard? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I don't remember when I met him, but I was a member of JOMO, one of the organizations that merged to become the African People's Socialist Party. So I know I met him at some point. I think it was a brilliant strategy to build a party, and I know JOMO, I had never thought about it back then, but and maybe you can say more about this, Chairman. I think the JOMO sort of was a militant mass organization. It didn't, to me, just looking back on it, it didn't seem to function quite like a party, but it was certainly the beginning, the seed of a party, and I think it just made total sense for that merger to happen and the creation of the African People's Socialist Party. Built off the sanitation workers strike in 1968, August of 1968. I know it definitely had a working class base, was the working class. The black petty bourgeoisie was leading those demonstrations in St. Petersburg around the sanitation workers' strike. But we kind of made our own demonstrations when we got into those demonstrations and people started following Jomo. I thought it just seemed like the world was moving so fast at the time. Something going on every day and during the 60s and the sanitation workers strike. Of course, when you were attacked by the police and shortly after, the whole city went up in flames in the rebellion of 1968. And I remember riding through the streets of St. Petersburg, and you could just barely see with all the tear gas. And the city of St. Petersburg had this big armored vehicle, a big white armored vehicle they called a monster. And so many things happened. It was a real military engagement. I remember police being lined up across the street on 16th Street, and one of the Brit boys just trying to lure them down to the other end of 16th Street. They wouldn't come, but he tried to lure them down to the other end of 16th Street. So it was a period of great intensity, and I think a lot of people came out of that struggle because it was kind of educating us at light speed. And I just think it's hard to explain because I think it's not, of course, the African People's Socialist Party was born from that, but it's kind of hard to convey how intense it was because it was every day, every day. And the presence of the police was so deep. And of course, the rebellion went on for several days, fires in several different places in the city. And I think it just, of course, when you pull down that mural, I think that changed the course of what a so-called civil rights movement that ended up being a Black Power movement was going in this city. Uhuru.
Yeah, the rebellion in St. Petersburg actually lasted months. The insurrection. It was not just rising up and burning and looting as the story goes, but there were guerrilla attacks. Incessant. So much so that the fire department at night had to stop using the sirens because of fear of panicking the population. And you learned to recognize the sound of these fire trucks by the sound of the engines and what have you. It was relentless. It was an ongoing kind of uprising that happened in the city. I don't know of any other place. There was a time where they recounted in some of the media the number of fires and what have you that had lasted, over this long period of time, months long period of time. And the Africans in this city really learned guerrilla warfare, and it was so intense. I remember on one occasion there was a warehouse. You may remember this, Chimarenga. There was a warehouse, and they had hired these guards. It's sort of like in the African community. They had hired these guards to protect the property of whatever the white owners, whoever they were. And it was so intense that on one occasion, the guards who were circling the building, they came across the building and they confronted each other and had a shootout. You know what I mean? Because that's how frightened they were. It was a very, very intense kind of resistance. It was deep in this city. And that's something that the city is doing everything it can do is to remove that history and remove from the consciousness of the people. But that's one thing we've said about the Africans in the city of St. Petersburg. We're just like everybody else, but this is the only place that from the 1960s, there has been unrelenting struggle. The party, Jomo, the party, SNCC, Jomo, the party, we've been here for all that time. And so, you've got generations of people here who grew up with it, or their parents or their grandparents. They tell them these stories about what happened here. It is a living history, which is one of the reasons it's important for what it is that we're doing right now, because it's not just the history of St. Petersburg, it's the history of the resistance of African people, and it was concentrated here, perhaps more than any place else, because, you can go back. People remember the Black Panther Party from Oakland, California. What many people do not remember is the last history of resistance in Oakland, California was the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement. The Panther Party had a real, actual, say, revolutionary existence of maybe 3 years. But it was the party, African People's Socialist Party, and the Uhuru movement that really built a revolutionary struggle, and that was the last evidence of revolution that happened in Oakland, California. In fact, we presided over in many ways not the funeral, but the last days of Huey P. Newton was spent, in a relationship with the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement. So that's part of what I would offer now in terms of this period. And it's hard for people, I think, many instances to recognize the significance. But it's one of the reasons why we say we're not going backwards. We're not going to go and do another civil rights movement. That's crazy. And that's what Black Lives Matter, and that's what Hands Up, Don't Shoot. That's like going back to the 50s, to do a civil rights movement. The thing that makes the African People's Socialist Party, one of the things that makes the party so significant, is that not only did we, the party, get engaged in continuing the revolutionary project that had been defeated in the 1960s, but we saw it as our mission. We stated it as our mission to actually defeat this counterinsurgency, which is a program that white power uses to crush revolution, to keep people from making revolution, to destroy revolutionary movement. The African People's Socialist Party, we made it our mission, and it was a stated mission. We told the world, and kept it before ourselves, that we had to defeat this counterinsurgency. We say that one of the primary tasks we said that it was so difficult to try to win people to the revolution when the last memory people had of revolution was tanks in the street, like Chimarenga just mentioned. And I'm glad Chimarenga mentioned the monster, the tanks in the street in St. Petersburg, Florida. That was what, 1960 what? 1968, because people want to act like they just had the militarization of the police department, what they saw in Ferguson. That's 1968, we dealing with tanks in the streets of St. Petersburg, Florida. So the thing was how this is the last memory that people had of struggle. Assassinations, mass arrests, things like that on a regular basis, and then so it was extremely intimidating, and many of the leaders were killed. Many of the people were arrested. I heard from Omali Yeshitela, who was just saying that the brother from SNCC that I was mentioning earlier, his name was Leotis Johnson, and he got 30 years. He got 30 years in Houston, Texas, for marijuana, and this is what they were doing to us at that time. When they arrested me for the mural, they charged me with 11 offenses for taking that mural down, and then gave me a 5-year prison sentence. This was what they were trying to do to crush this revolution, and this was the counterinsurgency that we were talking about. Malcolm dead, King dead, Panthers being killed. I'm in and out of jail on a regular basis. Lawrence Mann killed. I mean, this was a part of the whole process. So to move beyond that, we had to defeat this counterinsurgency, because it was hard to win people to revolution when that's the last memory they had of revolution. Then the organizations are destroyed and what have you. We got to go back and get the people, and that's why we created the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. First, the People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, because you say, okay, we ain't going to be able to get people come straight into revolution. What do? Well, we bring people into struggles around these tenants, what's happening with the housing, what's happening with these merchants in our community, what's happening in the schools, what happened with police violence and stuff like that. We take these issues. Under the revolutionary leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, we built a movement for democratic rights that would project the revolution as opposed to seeing it as an end unto itself. Otherwise, what you'd be doing is fighting police violence forever, because the police are going to always be violent. There's no way in hell that's not going to end unless you end colonialism. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting to get better situation for your children in school forever. Because the school system always going to treat the children, I don't care what the NAACP or any of these other organizations say, that's the mission of the school system. Colonialism is there to destroy, not to build, not to create or anything else. So we got to get rid of that. And that's why it was so important to, if we make struggle around these questions, then it has to be under the leadership of the revolution. So the People's Democratic Uhuru Movement did not require people to be revolutionaries, but it did mean that it was a revolutionary organization, because it was a part of the strategy of the revolution to bring people back into political life so that we can be in a situation to win. Vincent, you got anything to say, comrade?
Oh, yeah. Hold up. Let me get this.
We've lost you. Can't hear you. Are you there, Vince?
Do you hear me?
I just heard that. That's the only thing I've heard.
Yeah, okay. I'm one of my earlier, there's a lot of things on the background. Very, very impressive thing with matter of fact, both me and Lawrence, when we had the African Liberation Day in St. Pete. So it's actually, me and him talked about it, the first time we've seen that many black people get together, for that type of situation. Always on my mind about, it was always in our mind about thinking about, we can get this together, because it was very impressive. And I always think about the African Liberation Day celebration.
Well, the African Liberation Day was important to us also because it reminds us of who we are.
Yeah.
It reminds us of who we are, Yeah. And African Liberation Day, the initial ALD was organized by a man named Owusu Sadauki. His colonial name was Howard Fuller. And he had spent some time in Mozambique behind the lines with Frelimo. And he wanted to know what he could do when he got back. And they told him to organize the ALD and win support for the national liberation struggles that were happening on the continent of Africa from Africans who were in the United States. And that was the first ALD. That was part of what it was designed to do. And the slogan may have been, "There is no peace. Africa is at war." And because many people did not even know what was happening on the continent of Africa to our people, that may have been the slogan. If it wasn't the slogan the first time, it was a slogan sometime afterwards. Yeah. Chimaring?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment about the circumstances during the 1968 rebellion in St. Petersburg. Many times you said that law is the opinion of the ruling class, and they used the law, the so-called law. I remember being in an incident where a pig was going down the street. We're going down the street the other way, and somebody yelled out of the car, "Pigs!" Police turn around in the middle of the street, get behind us, turn on the light, and he said, "Who said that? Who said that? Tell me who said it, or everybody in the car is going to jail." So the guy volunteered to say, "I said it." They took him to jail. So, of course, they were using the law like that to encircle our community, and the police were everywhere. So even what you said, they claim it's a free country. We know that's a farce. And I think during those periods, it becomes very clear that there is no freedom of speech. You have to fight for everything we got. We fought for every inch of ground that we got back in the 60s.
Well, they created a law here in St. Petersburg, if you remember, called verbal abuse against the police.
And that's what they used on him.
Yeah, because
exactly
the whole African population had been so won ideologically, especially young Africans, that it was common to hear the pigs, the pigs, the pigs. And Jomo was such in this city that you could walk into any African community and during any time of day or night and go uhuru, and doors would fly open and Africans would come out putting on their denim outfits and what have you. It was that tight. On one occasion, this must have been in 1968, I guess after the assassination of King. And I was out on bail, appeal bond from the mural. And A.D. King, Martin Luther King's brother, Ralph David Abernathy, a host of others from the SCLC had been brought to the city of St. Petersburg in part, this was during the sanitation struggles, in part to contend with Jomo. Because Jomo was the leading force in the African working class. That's where Jomo was so powerful that our uniforms, which were, the denim uniforms and what have you, first time I ever saw it, and you probably never seen it again, that they literally had to chain these uniforms. I say uniforms, but they were just denims, right? Denim jackets. They actually put chains on them in the department stores because every African wanted to be Jomo'd up, right? And so we'd go to the department stores and get our Jomo outfits, and that was how it was. And then, so we were such an influence, and they were so concerned that they sent SCLC into the city to organize, because the sanitation workers at the time, the primary force that they called the leader was a lawyer. They named something around him for him. His name was James Sanderlin. And there's a Sanderlin Center. He was the primary force that was supposed to be leading them. And I knew Sanderlin, but this was the middle class, petty bourgeoisie. And the workers, he has as much in common with the workers, as the white government that the working class had to deal with. And so what happened was they needed somebody who could organize the workers in this city because Jomo was the primary force. And so they brought in SCLC, they brought in some other forces that we call them hired guns out of Atlanta who were supposed to be organizers and things like that. And what was really striking, a couple of things. On one occasion, they were having this huge rally at Gibbs High School, when Gibbs High School used to be Gibbs High School. And before it became what it is now. And they had all these civil rights people and everybody supposed to be there and bringing out all the people in the community. And it was really interesting because they didn't invite us at all, right? And in fact, they didn't want us there. And so finally somebody comes in to the Freedom House and says, Chairman, the people are demanding that you come and speak, right? So we go to Gibbs, and if you can imagine this sort of, what do you call it? It's not a square, but one side's longer than the others. Say it again.
Oblong?
No, rectangle. Is that? Yeah. So, on one end, on the northern side was the stage and everything, right? There's a stage there, and then, and before the stage, this huge auditorium filled with people. So I finally get there, and I walk in, there's a side door that's right before the stage, right? And I walk through the door with comrades who sort of, I guess, made up a kind of entourage, and when I walked in, there was this huge uproar. It shook me for a minute, and that was the people, they were cheering because I had come into the place, right? And all around the wall of the auditorium, the entire auditorium, all around the wall of the auditorium, Africans in denims, Jomo and denims and berets and combat lined the entire wall of the auditorium. And like I said, Ralph David Abernathy and that was, and then A.D. King, Martin's brother, was there, and we had some interesting dialogue. And I made a stone black nationalist presentation. And what was really interesting about it, cheering louder than anybody, there was a section of little old white women sitting in the front of this place, and they're cheering, and I'm talking about black nationalism and, black this and black that, and they're going, yeah. And that was one of the most extraordinary sights. But the real thing that was so interesting is that the people, they couldn't have that meeting without us. So even though they brought these people in to organize around us, it was impossible to do that. Our presence so dominated this situation in the city of St. Petersburg. And that's what led, to the development of the party and the context. We were probably the most active, deeply grounded kind of movement in the state of Florida. And a lot of people who want to know about Black Power, would come through St. Petersburg, to talk to us, like about that. And it was not unusual because we were learning from each other every place. And sometimes we were learning from each other through the media. We'd read about what some Africans were doing here and there and what they were saying and what the slogans were, et cetera. And then we'd take it, and the media, the ruling class got hip to that we were learning from each other through their media. So they began to stop doing that. And they came up with the statement that somehow that we were manipulating the media, right? And so they would stop giving us the coverage. And that's one of the things that made the Black Panther newspaper and the Burning Spear newspaper and Muhammad Speak so important. And that's another thing I want to say, that everything that we did, Vincent mentioned Ebony Star. Everywhere, all around this country, Africans were learning how to speak for ourselves, creating our own mediums, to speak to our own people and things like that. And I cannot overstate the significance of the Burning Spear. It's something that every community that you could go into, you would find Africans in this country who were selling Muhammad Speaks, who were selling the Black Panther newspaper, who were selling the Burning Spear newspaper. Almost everywhere, that's what you would see. And it gave a real sense of confidence to the whole community, because even if the people didn't plan to buy the newspaper, there was something comforting to the community to see these young Africans out there with this newspaper, know that somebody's always looking out for the community all the time. And that's one of the other things that makes the Burning Spear and our work with the media so significant. So it's now 9:27, and perhaps we can open it up for people who may, unless Vincent or Chimarenga want to say something before we move it forward.
Just briefly, Chairman, I think this is a really important study, and I don't want the members of our party and our supporters to believe it's about nostalgia, because it's not. It is really about showing the consistent trajectory, revolutionary trajectory, up to where we're at now. It had a starting point. You know, and you mentioned how people come into a movement and think that it's always been that way, and it hasn't always been that.
It's about them.
Yeah.
Think it's about them. Well, I'm here now, well, you know, and look how wonderful I am, etc. You know.
Right.
And all of us stand on a foundation. I mean, all of us stand on a foundation, and I think that's really important. The reason we want to do this, and you should read chapter 5 in Uneasy Equilibrium. This is not a substitute for it, but it's something that complements it. It contributes to, I think, what should be the popularity of it. It makes it easier to read and digest, and you can now know some things behind the scenes, and et cetera. But this is really important, to know the history of this movement. And there's so much history. There's so much that you read about. Some of you have read about Garvey and read about Lenin and read about all this, but you didn't have this opportunity to see what was going on and who was doing it and what happened, you know, et cetera, at this time. I mean, I got arrested. I got out on bond, on appeal bond, for tearing that mural down. And when I got out on bond, these comrades in Gainesville, Florida, young people who were in jail for protesting what happened, they asked me to come up to participate in a demonstration because I had the name, right, and had some organizing skills. And so they wanted me to come into Gainesville and to participate in this demonstration to free these young Africans who were locked up in jail. And so I caught a Greyhound bus. And then when I got off the Greyhound bus, the day I got off the Greyhound bus, I learned that King had been assassinated. So that would have been April 4th. I had been out of jail for 2 days. And so now the demonstration that I was coming for has to change, because it's no longer just about them. They've killed King. And King was this huge symbol out there. And so I'm out for 4 days when the demonstration happens. And then I get arrested. For inciting to riot. It's a new law that they created. There was no such law. They called it inciting to riot. There didn't have to be a riot. I just had to want one to happen when I spoke. It was a thought crime. So they said I said something with the intent to start a riot. So they locked me, Levy Wilcox, up in jail. So we're in jail now. I'm in jail for a month, right? I'm out on a bond, appeal bond, for the mural charge. I'm afraid now that I've been arrested for this, that they will snatch me up and take me back to prison off that other bond. So I fix it. So anyway, I get out a month to the day, and then I'm out for 6 hours. And in St. Petersburg, Florida, at this time, the Brett boys, who were sanitation workers, right? They drove a truck and blocked the gate so the trucks couldn't roll. Strike. The sanitation workers go on strike. When the sanitation workers go on strike now, I'm out. I get out. I'm out for 6 hours. The Attorney General of the state of Florida gets in touch with my bondsman and get my bondsman to come off my bond, so that they lock me back up. I'm out for 6 hours. They lock me back up in jail in Gainesville. And then I'm there for another half month. And before I get the bond again, there's a brother in Jacksonville who was willing to do my bond. An African bondsman in Jacksonville, Florida, did my bond. So I get out. Now when I get out, what I've done is organize for a car to be at the University of Florida, at a particular place at the University of Florida. So when they take me out of jail, we go to the University of Florida. And then I'm running through all these hallways and different places, et cetera, and ducking and dodging, and come out of the hallway to the place where the car is waiting for me. And I leave Gainesville on the floor of the back seat of the back of the car. I smuggled out of Gainesville, Florida, because I was concerned about being able to get here. Now when I get back to St. Petersburg, the sanitation strike is going on. They're having these little cute demonstrations. I mean, that's what they were, cute demonstration. White liberals from Eckert's, what was it called at the time? Was it Eckert's at that time? Oh, Florida Presbyterian.
No, it was Florida.
Florida Presbyterian, college is now called Eckert's, yeah. And liberals, and so they're having these cute little demonstrations. And when I get here, and they've written these horrible stories about me, right? Hate white people and violent, et cetera, et cetera. And when I get here, Africans say, yeah, that's just what we've been waiting for, right? And so, we build, Jomo right in the middle of this sanitation struggle, But that's part of that history. And it's a living and dynamic history, and it's really important because, you need to know something about where you're coming from in this process to know where the hell you are. If you think that history just started, it's like walking in the middle of a movie and thinking that you know everything about it, but you just showed up. The movie's been going on. This is the 6th reel. I don't know how many reels they did when they did reels and stuff like that, film. But the point is that it's been going on now, and it's really important to know where you are. And you also have to know that there's a finish line of sorts as well that you're fighting toward. It's like playing football and not knowing where you're starting and where the goal is. Something to that effect. So. Yeah, thank you, Chimaranga. Can we see if anybody else wants to participate in this? And also, when we say anybody else, that should include, when you open it up, that should include if Vincent thinks of anything and Chimaranga thinks of anything as well. All right, Uhuru.
All right, Uhuru, well, can we just salute this amazing discussion right now? Uhuru, Chairman, Chimaranga, and Vince Lawrence. And for everyone who is on the live stream on Facebook, please continue to share widely, invite your friends on. And for those who are on YouTube, we're going to open it now up for questions and discussion. We do have a few comments that I wanted to address. One is from Nanaya Grant in Philadelphia. He's also the Northern Regional Representative. It says, Uhuru, and thank you, Chairman, for enlightening us with your historical experience and the experience that shaped your political stance and understanding. We have Robin Wynn from Tampa, Florida, who says we should have this. Robin Wynn. Okay. We should have this type of unity today. Different organizations should get together and stand together. Salute you, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, for paving the way. And Comrade Jeffrey Abdul Alexander out in Springfield, Illinois says, one who does not know his or her history does not know him or herself. And I actually did really want to appreciate this discussion and something that Chimaranga said around this this discussion right now is not, based on wanting to be nostalgic and remembering the past just for old time's sake, but of how important it is to contextualize what we're doing today. Because even in this discussion, hearing about the history, just right here in St. Petersburg, Florida alone, having lived here my entire life, but like really, like Chairman said, this is this movement, this resistance has been existed in this small city, St. Petersburg, Florida, since the Black Revolution of the 60s. It's like a consistent thing, and the Uhuru movement and the party have really kept the struggle going here in this city, and it helps to understand what our stake is in it today in terms of preserving that history and continuing it, because we go out in the streets, we'll knock on doors and we'll hear from Africans who know Chairman, who say we were in Jomo, and it just really, gives us helps me to understand why St. Pete is so important to, our struggle as well. So I just wanted to contribute that. And David, you got some? Okay, Uhuru.
Uhuru, I have a question online from Panther First in Richmond, Virginia. He says, Uhuru, Chairman, the late Dr. Khalid Muhammad was affiliated with the Nation of Islam, and after expulsion was a significant presence in the New Black Panther Party. While not officially affiliated with African internationalism, he did often speak on African unity and anti-colonialism. Previously, you stated that the New Black Panther Party is essentially a coalition between a radical sector of the African petty bourgeoisie and lumping proletariat elements. Does this assessment apply to Dr. Muhammad? Are any of his points or assertions to be considered valid?
Yeah, I think that Khalid Muhammad, made some valid points and assertions. That for me has never been a question. In fact, for a while, we would hear frequently from Khalid Muhammad saying that he wanted to join the African People's Socialist Party. He came through San Francisco. This was before he did anything with the new Black Panther Party. He came through San Francisco, and I participated in an event there with him. It's the first time he ran into the African People's Socialist Party. And he indicated that he did. He would call frequently saying he wanted to join the party. And it's something that we didn't treat that seriously, not because we didn't think he was seriously necessarily, but because we knew that there was a divergence, ideological divergence between us and his politics. So yeah, I think that Khalid Muhammad did make valid points on frequently. But the question for us always is to what end? And Khalid was a very militant force, and I've seen him organize some very militant events, but I could not determine what the objective of the events were except the militancy itself that was occurring at the moment. Where was it going? So, I mean, this was what the issue was. I don't remember characterizing the new Black Panther Party as a kind of coalition between the radical petty bourgeoisie and the lumpen. It's something that I may have said. It's not something that I, can say that I did not say. But Khalid, had valid points, and so like our objections and struggles with Khalid would not be that he did not make valid points. In fact, it would be that I could never be able to discern what the objectives of Khalid Muhammad and where he was going, what the objectives were. And if you will, people who are in this study today, we wrote a whole thing on tactics and strategy for Black Revolution, and you can track down what it is that we're fighting for, what the objectives are in the movement, whether they are specific to the United States or taking the struggle of African people in the United States as part of the overall struggle for national liberation. It's got to be for something beyond the anger and the fact that we don't like what they've done to us and what they continue to do to us. What are our objectives? And that's the thing that I think distinguished us more than anything else.
Chairman? It's Penny, African People's Solidarity Committee, the organization of white people that, is an organization of the party inside of the white population, winning reparations to African people. And I really appreciate this study and all of the history, all of the history, this keeps falling down, that you've put out, from the very beginning. And I know that my first introduction to the African People's Socialist Party was at the foundation of APSC, the African People's Solidarity Committee, in 1976. So what you're talking about is actually 10 years before I was part of it. But I really appreciate the statement that that you put out, that the party will not be reliving the civil rights movement, and that the party has solved the problems left unresolved from the defeat, the counterinsurgency against the African Revolution of the 1960s. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. First thing I want to say is that when you talk about the African People's Solidarity Committee being created some 10 years after much of what it is that's being discussed now. And then I think 4 years after the actual founding of the African People's Socialist Party. And the first thing I really want to say is that it's important for everybody to understand that the African People's Solidarity Committee was created as a project to complete the Black Revolution of the 60s. It was about the liberation of African people. And because I felt like, and have felt like for a very long time, that our struggle has been a very, I don't want to characterize this stupid, but this ridiculous place, the anti-colonial sector of the movement, the sector of the movement that says we want to be free from white power, right? In that it would ignore, in some ways, the existence of white people, or it had come up with a kind of political articulation that either white people were the devil, right? And so I don't know a cure for that except some religious, exorcisms or something like that, or that white people were, like mutants, not really humans, etc. Which took us in a real difficult place because it made white people these extraordinary beings, like X-Men or something like that. These extraordinary beings that are not humans, and therefore you cannot come to certain conclusions about the relationship with white people that can be defined just in terms of human society and how forces and people do act in human society. In many ways, it's adopting the same kind of philosophical attitudes that's adopted toward African people, because what has happened is you have to dehumanize white people, right? I'm saying that the behavior of white people is human. That's a particularly important thing, even though the behavior of white people is something that we had never experienced before, and that it reeks of what might be characterized as inhumane, which is why it was so easy for so many people to say, yeah, the white man is the devil, and why it's so easy for them to say that white people must be some kind of mutation because they ain't like the rest of us. But we can say that there's a material basis for how white people act and function, and that's one of the things that we would talk about in terms of solving some problems for the revolution. We were able to do that. And another thing that's not spoken of so frequently is that we said, one of the things that made SNCC significant is that it was involved like in the civil rights movement, the fight for democracy for African people. But then it said black power. And so now this question of black power transcends the question of just rights inside the society. It says now we want to have the ability to make our own rights. Which rights is another term, it's a legal term. That's what rights are, it's a legal term. And we want to have control of our own lives. And so while you have many so-called nationalists who talked about, the evils of the white man, et cetera, few of them were able to place that in the context of the struggle for state power. And that's what we said, black power is a struggle for state power, and from the perspective of the African People's Socialist Party, African internationalism, it is a struggle for state power under the leadership of the African working class. So those are some of the things that the party played important role in terms of solving some of the contradictions that we were confronted with. And I think fundamentally just the introduction of science to the struggle, so that we're not just dragged around by events, because events happen all the time, bad events, good events, and you can be swayed one way or the other by, you can see a Klansman, and this happens to us all the time. They'll show somebody from the Klan that might be, see this guy, they did a wonderful thing. They gave toys to the poor black children, or they may have helped this or helped that. You see the cops playing basketball, etc. And so you can get swayed by, okay, the cops are playing basketball with the children, therefore the cops can't be all that bad. Or the cops stopped and gave mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to this person who was dying, therefore the cops can't be that bad. And they have us, just being moved by events, as opposed to having some kind of science that within which you can contextualize every event that occurs. I understand why the cop plays basketball. It ain't got nothing to do with them being nice people. They're trying to seduce a community that they oppress. That's another weapon that they're using, and they got tasing. They got shooting, they got clubbing, they got jail, and they got basketball. And all of them played the same function in terms of, colonial, subjugation of the population. Those are some of the things that we're talking about. And yeah, Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, we have a comment from Nana Yaw in Philadelphia. All right. He says the U.S. imperialist military also used to use the Excite to riot against Africans on the Marine Corps aircraft base in Beaufort, South Carolina in the 70s. They threatened to lock up black soldiers who would congregate outside. We couldn't understand what that was all about. We challenged it, and their excuse was that blacks were engaged in exciting a riot. If more than 2 blacks were seen standing and talking, that meant that we were plotting to excite a riot. A lot of people never had knowledge of this.
Well, yeah, I remember when they assassinated King, the U.S. government literally had to put tanks around the White House. Well, the rebellions happened every place, but I guess they thought there was a possibility we might have been organized well enough to seize the White House. Unfortunately, they were wrong. So there's always this, and if anybody here who's ever participated in what they now call West Indian Days in New York, where at least 1 million Africans used to come out to these parades and just to have a good time in New York. And as soon as it looks like it might be getting dark, they come on horseback, the police chase people out. And right here in the city of St. Petersburg, where Martin Luther King Day events and celebration, where thousands of African people would come out for that, the police are there. I mean, the whole idea of a lot of African people getting together is a real threat and problem, no matter what the occasion is, whether it's a graduation party or anything. That's where they killed, what was the young brother they killed? Dawson, Javon Dawson. It doesn't matter, because the probability is if you get a group of Africans together, they begin to sum up. Even if they don't call it a sum up, they just start talking about what's happening in our lives. And what's happening in our lives is white people messing with us. And the police messing with us, or white power messing with us. And so that's always problematic. Yeah. Even gentrification plays a role in dispersing African people so that we can't communicate with each other to plot.
We have another comment from Malika Alexander in Springfield, Illinois. She says, Uhuru, Chairman, as a child of the 60s, I can remember being totally enthralled with the Black Power movement. That was my introduction to the question of struggle. Getting this education brings it full circle. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, and also I don't know if maybe Vincent Lawrence can speak to this as well. I'm really curious about Comrade Keturah Carey and also, just how that relationship came to be. So I was wondering if you guys could expound on that. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Vincent, how well did you know Keturah? Well, Keturah Carey was someone that I actually met during. Are you?
Yeah. No, pretty good. Because, as a matter of fact, a couple times we went up to Gainesville.
Who was that? You and Lawrence?
Yeah, one time me and Lawrence, and I think one time I went up there. I went up there and rode up by myself. For some reason, Lawrence could not make it.
Well, Keturah was an incredible woman. She was a school teacher, and an elementary school teacher in a little place called Archer, Florida. Archer, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And she first got into big time trouble because most of our students might have been white. Certainly a large sector of them were white. Archer is a real rural, was then, a real rural community where, and sometimes the Africans, they would come out of school early in order to deal with the crops and things like that. And that's the place where I first saw, little toddlers, literally toddlers who were with their parents, and they would be taking, what is it called, shucking the peanuts, where you take the peanuts out of the ground, and it's sand everywhere, and little children just covered in sand and what have you, doing that. But she was a teacher. She took a poem, What Shall I Tell My Children Who Are Black? I forgot the name of the sister from Chicago who had written that poem. What was her name? No, well, I don't think it was Gwendolyn Brooks. I don't think it was. It was another sister, I think, out of Chicago, because I met with the sister subsequent. Was Gwendolyn from Chicago? Okay, perhaps it was Gwendolyn Brooks. And she had posted that on her blackboard, on a bulletin board, and then she had, put red, black, and green, papers, like around that, and she got in trouble for that. And we ended up in some kind of struggle around that. She joined the party and the movement. Well, first of all, she was already working with comrades from the continent of Africa. In fact, she was the one who put us in practical relationship with comrades from Africa, particularly from Zimbabwe, which is how we happened to form the first ZANU support committee in this country, because of work that Keturah had done. And she was bold. I mean, I remember once we were on campus at the University of Florida, where we literally seized the radio station. We literally just went in and took over the radio station and began, broadcasting, the school board moved to fire her because there was a person who was on the city council of, whose name I can't remember, in Gainesville, who had been, had written counterinsurgency manuals and stuff like that. He was really a counterinsurgency expert. He had books in the library on counterinsurgency. And he was put in charge of a school, I think it was called Mountaintop, named for Martin Luther King's speech, I've been to, of Africans. And he was an incredibly offensive presence. And Keturah was engaged in those struggles around this guy, and he moved on Keturah. And they had a real plan. They went and talked to her roommate that she was had guns and was planning to kill these people, and did everything they could to discredit her. And then we ran her for school board as part of the defense, for that. And she was, like I said, she was just an incredible force. She really was. And I'm understating her significance. And the old Burning Spear newspapers, I'm hoping that we will be able to locate that could recount some of the struggles that she led. She was one of the early people who worked on the Burning Spear newspaper. Yeah. She was a very powerful and influential person, not only in our own movement, but also like in Gainesville in particular. She was from Virginia, which is where she died, Uhuru. Yeah. Yes.
This year also, we organized that march on stocks, to the prison. Was she part of that, to the lecture chair thing? Was she part of that?
Yeah, you were there. You were there for that march on Stark.
Yeah, I marched there. Matter of fact, I marched halfway before my knee gave out. Then I rode the rest of the way in, but I was there.
Yeah, we marched from Gainesville, Florida, to the prison in Stark, Florida. I've forgotten how many miles that was. That was a long march. That was a long march, In fact, we.
15 miles.
Well, I know we also
pretty
marched
close.
from here to the courthouse in Clearwater. The one we call it the Great Long March to Stark.
Yeah,
to
I
Stark,
remember.
yeah. And to call attention to what they were doing to the Africans in the prisons there in Stark. Yeah, she was a part of that. She was a part of that. Yeah, Uhuru.
Thank you, comrades, again. We're going to go into announcements, but I wanted to know if all of the panelists had any lasting closing statements they wanted to say before we officially close it out. Uhuru.
Any closing statements, Vincent? Vince, any closing statements? Chimaranga?
Yeah, I just want to express appreciation to yourself, Chairman, and to Director.
Other than we will keep working forward because the revolution is real and
A little delay there.
Oh, Vince, the revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? So, yeah, I'm glad to see that you're still in the house too, Comrade Vincent. I really am. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you're here, and it gives me an opportunity to recall, much of the work that we did in the past, and Comrade Lawrence Mann, who we don't talk that much about, but he was an incredible force, and he was, if I'm not mistaken, the vice president of NAACP in Fort Myers. He was an incredible singer. He was friends with Lil Willie John, and I know you guys don't know who Lil Willie John was, but Lil Willie John was a real path finder, path breaker, in the whole rhythm and blues thing. He was somebody who preceded and presaged people like Sam Cooke and whatever. You hear Lil Willie John, singing Fever that was stolen. What's that white woman who's Peggy somebody who remade that song? Well, she did the song anyway. So yeah, Lawrence Mann was an incredible force. Chimaranga.
Yeah, I just want to express appreciation to yourself for building this movement in more than 50 years, building the African People's Socialist Party, and also Director Akile for just allowing me to be a part of it. I think it's really important. I think we probably would take months to tell a long history of a movement in the African People's Socialist Party, but I think this is a great beginning to helping our young comrades particularly understand the history of the African People's Socialist Party and what they are a part of. Uhuru.
Uhuru. I think part of what this shows is the tenacity of the party, that one of the things that's made it so significant that we never surrendered. We've been here and we've watched others step out of the ring, watch them surrender, and at difficult times, it's easy to be a revolutionary when everything is going well for you. Everything goes your way. It's not hard to be in the movement. It's just when times of struggle, when you are being struggled with, when conditions are struggling, when imperialism is struggling with you, that's when it's difficult. And we've seen many people leave the field. We've seen people after the attack on the Uhuru House in 1996, where the government used all the tear gas they had in the city. We saw people actually quit as a consequence, get out of town as a consequence. So people have left the movement at different times. And it's really important for everybody here to understand that this is a history, this movement has a history of resistance and resilience, and that we will be here until freedom is won. Uhuru Comrade Akile.
Uhuru.
Yeah.
Uhuru, just want to salute again to our amazing presenters in today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, Chimaranga Silambao, and Comrade Vincent Lawrence out of Fort Myers. And this is going to be a continued series, so in a few weeks we will be diving right into the 70s. So just thank you and appreciate this amazing dynamic discussion. And because of time, we want to we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you, and we'll make sure that Chairman sees your question. And also, some of those questions will be answered within the coming weeks when we talk about, the breaking down the decades of the party. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Join the Freedom Mass Choir and Band. The Freedom Mass Choir and Band is an all-African community group of singers and instrumentalists that sing songs of resistance and revolution. Members are located throughout the United States and attend weekly rehearsals both in person and via live stream and video. Sign up by emailing blackpowerchoir@gmail.com or call 727-537-6736. Also know there is a call for instruments. This December, Uhuru Foods and Pies is calling on you to come to Oakland or St. Petersburg, Florida, to be a part of baking and selling 10,000 Uhuru Pies to support the programs of the Black Power Blueprint. Uhuru Pies is a 37-year-old loved progressive tradition in California and Florida. From December 20th to the 24th, brigades will meet at the Aquaba Hall for overviews and summations, be out in the community selling Uhuru Pies, including the signature Uhuru sweet potato pie, baking, phone banking, and winning people to support Black self-determination and reparations to the Black Power Blueprint. If you want to get involved, you can sign up at uhurupies.org. Last chance, comrades, brothers and sisters, December 9th through the 16th, come cruise with us aboard the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, a time for revolutionaries to kick back and relax. You'll be on board with Chairman Omali Yeshitela while getting to enjoy the spoils of the ship. Destinations include Grand Cayman, Mahogany Bay, Belize, and Cozumel, Mexico. Get signed up today at uhurulegacycruise.org. This cruise also serves as a fundraiser for the African Socialist International. If you are local to St. Pete or St. Louis, at the Uhuru House, 3 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement will be hosting our Black Power Sunday rallies, raising important concerns and community issues and organizing to overturn them. If you're local to any of these places, come on to 1245 Tyrone Lewis Avenue South or 4101 West Florissant to learn how you can get involved and fight back against the things like police brutality, gentrification, homelessness, joblessness, and all the other issues plaguing our communities. And December 22nd, we'll be right here in Aquaba Hall celebrating 50 years of the Burning Spear newspaper with a live, intimate interview with Chairman Omali Yeshitela. That is happening on December 22nd. At 6 p.m. Eastern, and it'll be live streamed from the Burning Spear's TV YouTube page or Burning Spear on Facebook. Thank you all for tuning in. Next week, we'll be conducting an In Case You Missed It replay of last week's study, so make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch it. Thank you, comrades. Uhuru!